Behind me is a statue of Simón Bolívar, the liberator of 6 countries in South America. And the following is a conversation with Marie Arana, the author of one of the best books I read this year, a biography on Bolívar. What you'll see in this conversation is what it takes to create a unified narrative of the Hispanic community in the English language, but also in the United States. And she's done this throughout her life and through her many books, such as the biography on Bolívar, but also her latest book called LatinoLand, as well as her memoir, American Chica. And something I learned from this conversation, what I hope you will learn too, is that how much it takes to create this narrative and how important it is to preserve it. Not only the stories of our stories right now, but also our ancestors and what it means for the future of Hispanics and Latinos in the United States. And that work will take books, it will take movies, it will take interviews like this one and many more. And I hope that you get inspired. Thank you very much. You mentioned in your talk that how you came up with the name of the book was because you thought of the person who you loved the most, which was your dad, your father. When you think of your father, what was the one lesson that you learned from him?
Oh my God. I learned, first of all, how to be a Peruvian. I learned what it meant to have absolute unconditional love. I learned from him how important it was to hold on to your heritage and your past. He was, I ended up in nothing like his career. He was an engineer, and I ended up in the arts. But he was so supportive at every step of anything that I did, and was somebody who instilled me with love of family, love of country. I had gone back to Peru every year to be with my Peruvian family. And that was so important to him. And he actually expired before he saw these last 3 books of my, the book on Simón Bolívar, which he worried about because Peruvians don't like Bolívar. And of course, I revere Bolívar. He didn't get to see the book on Silver Sword and Stone, which was my history of Latin America and what it meant and how it lives today. And I think, and LatinoLand, of course, which he became a part of LatinoLand. And those works would have been so important to him, but I think in so many ways he lives in them. So I'm very grateful to the respect that he always had for the Latin American past. Our families passed in it. We, Aranas were on the ground in Peru from the 16th century. So, it was very important to him, and it became very important to me.
People like your father are people that need to be examples to the community, to the entire, Latino community, Hispanic community, of people who are proud of their heritage and where they came from, but also how well they're able to integrate,
right,
and make it part of the American story.
Absolutely, and it is a part of the American story. It is very embedded, very engraved in the American story, and I think that people need to know that because it hurts me. It really me duele. It hurts me when I hear that that people want to get rid of that past, or are ashamed of that past, or ashamed of that identity and want to blend in, nothing but blend in, when it is such an important, glorious, and gorgeous past of who we are. So it's important.
I'm also an immigrant like him, and something that we talk a lot about is our family values, right? And coming from India, we also we have a very strong emphasis on family, right? On family values, family culture. Every day we would eat our meals together, right? Which is something that you don't see here in a lot of families. So all these traditions, right, which you come here and you want the next generation to continue and you want it to disseminate, right? What's the most effective way of doing that? How do you make it a part of the just the culture in general? Like, how do you make?
Yeah, it's a really good question because, and I appreciate that about my Indian friends, that they have the same values that I do as far as that's concerned. They also have the very same values about work ethic and such. But the family is so important. And it's interesting to notice that that is something that really doesn't get lost. And this is in the Latino culture, you hold on to it, even though you may have been here hundreds of years. You see this in the Mexican community. And I think the reason why is that you hold on to that part of the culture, even though you may have lost the language, even though you may have lost even the religion, and you may have moved on to another religion, or you may have intermarried many times through the generations, but somehow that love of family perdures. I mean, it lasts and it's handed on, and that's so important, I think, because you realize that in this very fragmented American world, in a world that is, in this country which is so inclined to live apart from its family, that you find that even still in, let's say, Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California, Texas, you find that Latinos do not want to leave their families to go and get work somewhere else in another region. And I have found this working at the Washington Post, when we tried to, I was the only Latina in the editorial area, trying to get Latinos to come and work, and it was very hard because family was so important. I don't think that's anything we're going to lose to. And I don't think in the Indian families either it's going to be anything you're going to lose to.
What about language?
Language gets lost so easily.
Yeah.
Yeah, it gets lost so easily. And
Do you think it's important? I mean, I consider it important, right? But how do you like sustain it?
It's culturally is so important in so many ways. But it's the first thing to go. It's cultural attrition. It is the first thing to go. And why? It's like, well, when I came at the age of 10 to this country, my brother and sister were taking Spanish language classes, and I thought, that's ridiculous. We speak Spanish. Why do I want to take a class I'm going to get an A in all the time? So I was taking Russian, I was taking French, I was taking a lot of languages. I ended up studying Chinese. And an example like me is the reason why we lose language sometimes is because you actually don't study it, you don't use it. We came from a family where the only time that we used it was in the confines of the walls of our house. So and that's hard on kids, and sometimes families decide that what they want is for the children to succeed, and the only way they're going to succeed is by being more American and sounding more American and having their English be better so that they can do better in school. And so that's the most natural thing to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you thought about writing a book in Spanish?
All of my books appear in Spanish, and I do all the editing for them. I would never translate them myself. Why? Because it's like writing it all over again. It's I've written it once, and I'd rather edit it and, go through it. I'm doing this now with LatinoLand, which will come out in February of 2025. And it's a joy, believe me, it's a joy to see it in Spanish, but I would never write it in Spanish.
Yeah, I mean, for myself, I've done that process of writing, because now it's so much easier for me just to write it in English than write it in Spanish. But I think when the language that you think of becomes sort of its own shape and its own structure.
Absolute.
So it definitely has an effect on the writing and even the whole thesis of what.
Yes, and that's a really good point, because when I wrote American Chica, which was my memoir, which was my first book, it's 8 books ago, I was thinking in Spanish, but writing in English. And it was really interesting, because when I was nominated and got to be a finalist for the National Book Award, the one thing that they said in their citation was, we can hear the Peruvian Spanish in her English. And that was such a joy to me, because it was true. I was thinking in Spanish, but writing it in English. And you get that flavor, I think, when people do that.
Such a very descriptive, specific feedback. Something that you knew, but unless someone had told you.
Told me, I didn't
realize.
Yeah. So I had transmitted that successfully.
So you're a person who has so much energy and excitement and just the world, your ideas, your books, and just this desire to change culture through your books and your speaking and everything else. What gives you hope about the future, that excitement that you have when you talk to us and we talk to everyone you talk to?
Well, first of all, I'm excited about books. I mean, that has been my whole life. And I started in books that not necessarily about Latin America or Latinos. And what I saw was a whole. There were wonderful books, wonderful academic books, wonderful books of different kinds, but there were not the sort of books that I wanted to read. And I sat down really to write the sort of books that I wanted to read, comprehensive books that would tell you something about the people we are, and the things that we value, and where we come from, and why we are the way we are. And so that keeps me going with the writing. Fundamentally, it's all about reading and books and how important the culture of the literary world is, and how much you can. When you write a book, you're working alone. When you read a book, you're working alone. But there is something incredibly magical about that transmission from one mind to another mind, and that other mind takes that book away in a very different way, perhaps, than you've written it. And that's a good thing, and that's a wonderful process. So that keeps me going.
If you weren't an author, how would you continue doing the same things that you're...
I'd probably be out, campaigning. I don't know. I've never imagined myself a politician, but I'm definitely somebody who feels very strong. Maybe I would be, I don't know, some sort of social worker. I believe that there are things that hold communities together. And those are the things, that's our most valuable thing as human beings, is how we work together and how we transmit this internal and instinctive goodness that we have in ourselves. And so that's whatever I would do would be with that spirit.
I don't know if this hasn't to you, but whenever you watch a movie or you read a book and you sort of think to yourself, I wish I had written or made a movie. Well, your Simon Bolivar book, it's something that I if you didn't know, I would have loved to take on the project. So I'm curious, and I'm sure I'll have other ideas and things like that. Like, what advice would you give to someone like me about, let's say, writing a similar book about, let's say, not necessarily Simon Bolivar, but things from that sort of part of the world, that history, from, let's say, the English perspective, like in terms of research, how you would actually approach the problem, giving context. Because you may know Spanish, but the Spanish back then is completely different from now, just like English. How would you sort of tackle that problem now that you've done it?
Well, I'll tell you something. When I started thinking about Bolivar being the right person to write about, because he was so representative of so much history and so much geography, there were 2,500 books on Bolivar sitting in the Library of Congress. And somehow that didn't stop me. And why didn't that stop me? Because I hadn't read in anything that I hadn't read the way that I wanted to learn about the man. The way I wanted to learn about the man was in very human ways, and in very sort of almost fictional ways. I mean, in novelistic terms, how would you reflect this life? And then to do that, but to have it so grounded in research. You have this incredible note section in the back, that it was totally grounded in research, because you had read his letters where he said, I could barely stay on my horse because the horse was sweating so much as I was going these 2,500 miles, full stop. and you take that detail and you put it in a book, and people say, "Oh, how did she know that the horse was sweaty?" But you do the work, and there it is. You find it in the letters, and then you make it come alive. And then the image of this man, just full out speeding down an uncut trail on his horse, with a horse sweating with so much exhaustion, becomes more colorful and more real and more human in a way. So, that's what I would say. Don't stop, because whatever somebody wrote before, you're going to find a different way.
If I remember correctly, I think Walter Isaacson said your book is just a masterful biography work, but it also felt like reading a novel. It's like finding that your own medium. The history has been told many times, and we sort of know the facts, but finding your own medium and how you tell the story, it's almost the innovation and the reason why people relate to certain stories rather than others.
The narrative is so important, right? I mean, and then sometimes I think that one of the challenges that Latinos have is we don't have a unified narrative. And I'm trying to get at that. My whole career has been trying to get at what is our narrative and how can we tell that story so that it actually means something to people who know nothing about us. So that framing is so important. I think there's so much more to be done about it. So, people need to get on the train and do it.
So how do you actually unify the narrative? Is it just by putting out the work in different mediums, or like how do you? Because a similar quote that I can think about is history is written by the victors in that sense. So is it are you making the narrative? Are you unifying the narrative? Is that what it actually takes to unify it?
Yeah. Well, sometimes it's different. Because in Silver Sword and Stone, I made a very big point, and at the very end of it, saying, the story has always been about Pizarro and the Inca. It's about Cortes and the Aztecs. But it's more about Cortes and about Pizarro than it is about the Aztecs or the Incas. The Incas and the Aztecs have their voice. So sometimes you have to get behind that structure and talk about the ands, the Incas and the Aztecs. And that's been, that was really important to that book. In the case of LatinoLand, in which I interviewed 237 people, those voices became my guiding light, because they were so different from so many different walks of life and from so many different countries that felt they had nothing to do with each other, but then fundamentally they would find they had something to do with each other, something unifying. So that was a different way to get at the narrative. On the one hand, you're working on history and trying to dig out those ands that you never know about because they didn't write the histories. And then the other example, which is you've got the people present and they can tell different stories, and then you shape those different stories into something that's unifying. Two very different challenges and very different ways to do writing.
That, how you approach LatinoLand reminds me of Leon Dash. What's the name?
Oh, I know Leon Dash. Yes.
Okay, so we actually...
So you're a professor?
We just recorded an interview that I'll send you.
Great.
Our interview, and we just talked to him about and his work of actually going into these communities and how he's wrote this wonderful.
Yeah.
And so that sort of reminded me of his work and how you sort of approach that. But so right now we've been traveling to Washington, and something that I've noticed is that let's say that you sort of meet this people from Nicaragua, El Salvador, all these countries, and they all sort of, when they meet me, because I've been in his sort of family side of all Indian people, and they also expect that I'm Indian. So when I talk to them in Spanish, it's sort of like their light just goes in their eyes. It's like, wait, you know Spanish? Like, who are you? And things like that. And something about their stories about how, their stories are always about resilience, about raising their kids and just trying to make it better. And when they meet me, I don't want to say it's like they see them like their kids or something like that, but they in a way they do. And
of course,
and it's something that it's so beautiful, because every time I meet this person just by chance, it's always they wish me so many good wishes and they kind of helped me. Like they gave me like phone numbers to talk to, and that part of the story that hasn't been really like told in that sense. So something I'm curious about. It's like, I thought about, okay, like maybe you could write and make some sort of like movie about this sort of like the immigration like story, in the sense of that everyone, like no matter who you are, like whether you come from Peru or Venezuela, Colombia, like India, like no matter what you sort of have the same, like that, the fact that you left your country, you left something.
Society trajectory, right? Yes. Yeah.
There's a quote in the movie Interstellar that says, in order to go somewhere, you have to leave something behind.
Right.
And
right.
so that question is like, what are we leaving behind? So
it's a great human unifier, because in this country, everyone has left something behind. Some people have forgotten that. Some people have forgotten that they've left something behind. But, this is very much an American story. So
we leave these things behind, and then we go forward. So how would you go about, let's say, making this? Yeah, like making this and like finding the right medium. Like one thing I would think about is like making a sort of movie or making some sort of like story in a more visual like way. Yeah. Like how would you recommend going about this?
Well, it's all a question of narrative. A narrative is told very differently in visual form than in written form. You need so much more detail in written form, and you need so much more information in visual form, in a way, because you see, I have friends whose books have been made into movies. They didn't think when they were writing about somebody's bedroom what would be in the drawers. Right? They didn't. I mean, that's not a part of the story. But when you're doing a film and you have an actor who's going to open a drawer, you've got to put things in the drawer because it's all got to be in character. It's a completely different framework. And I think the narrative needs to be reimagined almost in that framework. Same for a theatrical play. I mean, you have a certain space of time, you have an audience that's reacting in front of it, and you have to tell it differently. It has to have a different way, which is why you don't find playwrights who are sitting down and writing novels, because they're doing something very, very different in a very different medium. But they can translate, and they do. I mean, you send books to movies are common, but it takes a certain kind of mind and work to get it into a different framework. Totally.
You've achieved many things writing books. What's the one dream that you have that you would like to accomplish?
Right now, my dream is to have people in schools understanding what their history is, and I mean that in the widest, broadest sense. I mean not only American children in general, but Latinos in general too, and people and immigrant communities, so that they understand. When the Indian community began to come in great numbers, what was that story like? And I think we're missing that. We keep getting the old sort of, Paul Revere, American Revolution, only fought by George Washington. We're not getting the details and the nuance that we need to get as Americans in this very large story.
How do we do that? Last thing, like, how do we do it? Because I mean, we have so many different stories, and something I realized when I went to college is that, sure, like you learn the American history, but when you go to college, right? Like I went to a very diverse college. You have people from India and China and just all over the world. It's like, if you wanted to actually understand it, you actually have to learn their histories. So for me, I've read like books on Indian history and Chinese history, and then it just sort of, okay, like now it makes a lot more sense. So like, is the option just to have, let's say, more classes, like more like?
No, it needs to be earlier. Needs to be earlier. You can't get to college and then suddenly see the world open up. I think the world needs to open up much sooner. I think we need to know that the world is very open by the fourth grade, third grade. That you need to know those things, and not to be told a narrow story, because then you end up a very narrow person. And I think that the whole educational system right now is geared to tell a very narrow story. And your mind is blown by the time you get to college, because that's when it opens up. And it just needs to be sooner.
If you're anyone who speaks Spanish, you're probably be called Mexican at any given moment. But that's a reflection of the culture that is in place. So we just had a talk with an ex-ambassador. He worked in different administrations. And something he said is that the U.S. has recently gone more into isolation. And people that we met, actually just last week, was Catholic. And I asked, okay, where's the Pope from? And something he said was, oh, it's from Spain. Okay. But, I don't know. I mean, she said Argentina, and she thought Argentina was in Spain. Okay, but where exactly? And then, no idea. And you ask, okay, do you know anything about anything? Like, have you been out of the world, out of the U.S.? No,
No.
Never. So that's also important. You have any thoughts on how to change or sort of give more perspective into that side of the...
Well, of course. I mean, it's all in the teaching community. I mean, I think, at this point, first of all, not enough really qualified people are attracted to the teaching. I don't know where you went to if you went to public school or private school or whatever, but the qualifications for teaching are lowered by the fact that the income is so meager. They should be the most highly paid career in the country. Really, if you were future thinking, you would, and we haven't been future thinking. That they can barely pay for their families. So how are you expect to hand over a whole generations of people who are aware citizens to those who are paid well and who, they're going to be, the denomination of the level of person is going to be much lower. So there's a whole lot of work to be done. I mean, the whole social structure needs to be rethought in certain ways. And that's where I would begin.
Thank you for watching. And I encourage you to pick up her books. I would start with the biography on Bolívar, one of my favorite books that I read this year. And I think there's something important about reading these stories from an American perspective. I personally have learned a lot about Bolívar before, growing up in Venezuela. But I think something about reading it in English with an American perspective and seeing how, George Washington, Jefferson, and all these people had an influence on the Latin American independence movement made a big impact on me. And who knew that, the shortest, presidency in the U.S., like William Harrison, was an ambassador in the Great Colombia, was super against Bolívar. So maybe karma that he died pretty quickly after the presidency. However, something that I'd really take away and hope you take away from this conversation is that no matter how many times the stories have been told, they're always an opportunity to tell those stories with your own perspective. And what Maria Arana has done perfectly in her work is that she's able to tell the story from her perspective in a way that feels like reading a novel. And that's her unique style that has never been done before in the case of Bolívar. And as many other works. So as you go on with your life and there are so many stories that you would like to tell, remember that it doesn't matter how many times they have been told. What matters is that you bring your own essence and you bring what you write, you create work that you wish existed and that you wish you would like to read in this manner, because that's what Maria Arana did. She knew about hundreds of books about Bolívar, but there wasn't a book that had that specific narrative style that she likes to learn in. And with that, thank you very much.